We've got a very good panel here with a vast amount of experience, and I think about 47 different careers between them, a lot of them from Andrew Adonis, who has done so much. We're very pleased to have him on the panel, so I'll just do brief introductions. Chair, is that the right? Chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, previously Transport Secretary, of course, in the Labour government, an advisor to Tony Blair, and someone credited for lots of intense thinking in the Labour Party, especially over education, for the best part of 2 decades. So very glad to have him. Sorry, can you hear me right, by the way? I feel like I'm coming in and out of this microphone. Just about, okay. On my left, Mary Honeyball, MEP for London, I think for 17 years now, is that right? So very well qualified to talk about single market, Brexit negotiations, some of the topics that we're starting with today. And I think you had previously worked in the trade union movement, also a councillor in Barnet, so you've done a huge amount. I'm Peter Edwards, I'm editor of Labour List. I was previously a journalist, including a spell at City AM, which might be why I've, given my kind of financial services background, been chosen for this panel, and also worked for Shadow Treasury Minister for a few years. On my immediate right, Darren Jones, new MP for Bristol, which is it? Sorry, is it Northwest? Northwest. Yeah, give him a clap. Yeah. A surprise winner, but I think we were kind of all delighted to see him.
Surprise winner.
Yeah, but I'm sure his majority is only going to go up and up and up now. And as someone that campaigned for him in 2015, but not this time around, I'll take none of the credit at all, but be very happy to campaign for him again in future. And then there's always these jokes about on my far left and on my far right. I'm not going to make that. At the end of the panel is Shadow Cabinet Minister Barry Gardiner, who covers the international trade brief. Has been an MP for, how many years? 1997, so 20 years. I think previously did energy and climate change portfolio as well. Also, I can see he has a very expert graph in his paperwork in front of him. So feel free to...
Can I just say, I too was an unexpected winner in 1997, and I'm still here.
20 years on.
And I fully expect Darren to be here in 20 years' time.
That's worth a clap. Thank you. So great to have Barry here with us. I think Barry will go last because his slides are just being set up. So perhaps we could start with Andrew, if that's all right. Just to kick off, the formal title is Brexit negotiations, is a customs union or single market back on the table? I have an answer for that, but you're not really here to hear from me, so I'll let Andrew kick things off. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Peter, and congratulations again to Darren. I remember campaigning his seat 2 years ago, and it didn't make much difference. I didn't go near it this time, and he's got a huge majority, so maybe it's cause and effect. A confession to begin with. 2 confessions. First, I joined the SDP on my 18th birthday in 1981, above all else because I wanted to stay in Europe. My generation then was strongly pro-European. It has been ever since. And I wasn't prepared to support a Labour Party that wanted to take us out of Europe. That's my first confession. My second confession is that though I've been in politics a while, this is the first speech I have ever made on foreign policy or Europe. I've always taken the view up till now that you should only speak on things that you know about, that you should leave subjects in politics to people. I mean, no politicians know about anything, of course, but you should at least leave subjects of politics to people who know a bit more about them than the average. That already is a very severe limiting factor. But, and therefore I've spent the last 10, 15 years making at least one and often several speeches a day about school reform, about infrastructure, about all those sorts of things, but never about Europe. However, we're at a point of national crisis at the moment, and at points of national crisis, which I regard as similar in intensity to the mid-1970s when we had a big problem about how we managed the country in the face of trade union militancy, the mid-1980s with mass unemployment, maybe even the mid-1930s when we faced a big problem of massive European instability. The big issue that we face at the moment is, are we or are we not going to leave the international organisation which shapes Europe, which leads Europe, which is has been arguably the most successful force for stability that this continent has ever known. Are we going to leave that, or are we going to stay? Now, fortunately, I hold no front bench position. I hold no position of responsibility in the party at all. So I can tell you completely freely what I think, and that's what I'm now going to do. My view is very simple. This party is a European party and a pro-European party, or it is nothing. The idea that on the biggest issue facing this country in our generation, we should be sitting on the fence is abhorrent to everything I believe, and I think that's probably true of most of the people here this afternoon. First point. Second point, therefore, our whole negotiating position in these talks should be to gear ourselves to the maximum possible engagement in Europe, the maximum possible. Now, what we need to tease out in this session afterwards is what that is. And we should certainly not, as a party, be proposing to withdraw and take a lesser position because we somehow think it might be electorally expedient, or it might hold this Labour coalition together, as if you ever hold coalitions together by going down to the lowest common denominator. The third thing is that my experience of politics is as follows, that on second order issues, you have to be prepared to trade and compromise, and I've done my share of trades and compromises over the years. On first order issues, if you trade and compromise, you sell your soul. And if you sell your soul in a democracy like ours, other people will fill the vacuum very quickly, because we are a country that doesn't believe in being told what it's got to do. There are millions of people of our way of thinking who are pro-European and want to see this country remain at the heart of Europe. And also, you very, very rarely achieve your objectives. You know, Tony Blair, the big lesson he taught me, I sort of believed it before, which is the reason why I've always sat rather uncomfortably in political parties, was that that the right policy is the right politics. What you should always do is work out what is the right thing to do, and then you work out how to sell it. Now, he was very, very good at doing trades when he needed to do trades. God, the amount of time it took me to persuade him that we should abolish fox hunting. I mean, I think probably more time was spent on that 19th order issue than on anything else in my entire time in government. But on big issues, he knew what he thought, he knew what should be done, and he did it. And my message is very simple. We should know what we think, we should stand up for it, and we should do it. What does that mean? Obviously, it doesn't mean that we should be proposing to leave the single market. How can we be proposing to leave the single market and want to stay closely aligned with Europe? Obviously, we shouldn't be proposing to leave the customs union. Leaving the customs union, even if you're an anti-European who wants to leave the European Union, is absolutely barking mad. It means that not only do you disadvantage yourself in trade terms with the other 27 members of the European Union, but the 39 countries with which the EU has bilateral trade treaties, and by the way, it takes between 7 and 10 years to negotiate each trade treaty. So we will all be long dead before Liam Fox has negotiated his trade treaty with the rest of the world. The idea that we should be doing this is for the birds. So it's very simple, this. It's not complicated. Don't overcomplicate it. I love Keir Starmer to death, but he is massively overcomplicating it. It's very simple. We stay in the single market. We stay in the customs union. We are pro-European, and I believe if we stand up for that, we may end up staying in the European Union itself as well. There you are. That's my thoughts.
Thanks, that was really stirring stuff. Brilliant speech. Slightly horrifying, the thought of having to shadow Liam Fox for 390 years while the trade deals are done. I'm sure that won't be the case. Okay, let's go to Mary Honeyball next. Mary, thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you so much for the opportunity to talk to you. I will try and follow Andrew, which is going to be a hard act. But what I wanted to focus on more was the European side of this and what the Europeans think of us. And to be quite honest, not very much, I think, is the simple answer. And I have been amazed throughout all of this, right from the very beginning of Brexit, how everyone in this country has focused on what's going on here, what the UK is thinking, what the British government is thinking. Actually, the UK, the British government, us, are not where it's at. We are not the only show in town. We're not even a small part of the show in town. We are one country out of 27. And we're even in a worse position now that the Tories have managed to lose the election they thought they would win. And I have just found it extraordinary that journalists, commentators, even those in our own party, have thought to go along with the absolute mythology of this. We can talk as much as we like about whether we want a hard Brexit, a soft Brexit, the single market, the customs union. It will only happen if the European Union decides it is going to happen. And I think it would do us a lot of good if we thought about it from that point of view, from the European perspective rather than the British perspective. We have brought this on ourselves. This is an absolute British thing. We've created this, and to be honest, the Labour Party during the referendum did nothing very much to stop this happening. And I thank you for the nods. I mean, I got very, very depressed during the referendum campaign. All of the Labour MEPs were out campaigning all the time. And as people cynically said, it's not just because it's our livelihoods. It's because we all went into European politics because we believe in it, because we wanted to be in the European Parliament, because it mattered to us what happens there. And it does very much matter to this country what happens there. And when we leave, if we leave, we will lose all of that. So we need to look at it from the other point of view. And the Europeans actually, believe it or not, do not really want us to leave. We've heard Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron say, you can reconsider. We'll let you do that. We'd be very happy if you reconsidered. All of this doesn't seem to be getting through. And we've all found this deeply frustrating. And I would actually also add, saving Barry Gardiner's presence, that we found the front bench attitude deeply frustrating as well. It might, I concede, have gone some way towards doing as well as we did in the general election. I think there may have been a case then for the sort of fudge that's coming out of the Labour Party leadership at the moment. But that's done. We got a fantastic result, and we can't take that away. It was a very, very good result. But we're now in a new world. We're in a world where we can actually start moving things. Theresa May, I don't quite understand why Theresa May's going on. I think because she quite likes being Prime Minister. I haven't actually come up with any other reason why Theresa May is still there. But she is still there. But she might as well not be for all the strength that she's got behind her. I mean, she is in a remarkably weak position. And I was listening to one of the commentators earlier today, actually, on BBC News Channel, who actually said that she is, in his view, one of the weakest prime ministers we've had for the last 100 years. This is where we're at the moment, negotiating with the EU. And we could, in the Labour Party now, really be capitalising on that and saying that we have to stay in the single market, we have to stay in the customs union. If we don't do those two things, you haven't seen anything yet regarding austerity. If we think we've got austerity now, we don't like Tory austerity, we should just wait until we get austerity when we leave the European Union. We will not have seen anything like it at all for a very, very long time, probably, as Andrew said, since the 1930s. And we must take note of that. Project Fear during the referendum campaign was rightly criticised for many failings, but actually Project Fear was right. That is what will happen if we crash out of the European Union. But we've been in it for 43 years, and I actually find it amazing that anyone could think that we were going to leave a fantastic international organisation, which we have been an absolutely integral part of for 40 years, just to think we could just leave it, which was always the leave argument. It's okay, we'll just leave it, it'll all be all right, no problem. Well, it is a problem, and they are beginning to find out how much of a problem it is. It's been a year now since the referendum decision. We've had one negotiating session in a year. I mean, if we go on like this, given how much there is to do, this is not ever going to end. And this issue of citizens' rights, which that one negotiating session was on, is a very serious one. And I spent a day last week in the European Parliament listening to petitions from EU citizens in this country and British people living in EU countries. And they are worried. I mean, they're really worried. They're worried about their livelihood, their families. their children, and where they're going to go. They're facing deep uncertainty. And they've been put through this, right? A Tory government who wants to leave the EU for what I only can work out are largely ideological reasons. We should not be doing that. This is not the way to govern. This is not being empathetic. This is not the right thing to do, but this is what's going on. Where this will end, I suspect that I do actually believe Andrew is right, that this is not going to happen easily if it happens at all. We haven't even got to the difficult stuff yet. We will be doing citizens' rights, then we'll be doing the divorce settlement, and then at some point Ireland. Those three things have to be cleared before the EU will even think about talking about trade deals. Well, I think that's going to take till the end of the 2-year period. I mean, if we have one negotiation in 2 years, in 1 year, we've got another less than 2 years to go, about 18 months to go. Are we going to get much further than that? So we'll end up, when the Article 50 process ends in the middle of 2019, with nothing very much accomplished. So then what happens? It's all a nightmare story. It's total uncertainty for the people of this country and for the economy of this country. And we in the Labour Party should be standing up against that, saying this is actually not acceptable. We cannot go on like this. And I think in the end, I don't think it's going to happen at that exit time. I think what we will see perhaps is transitional deals. But at the end, I really just don't see how we can leave. And it's about time that we started to adapt our thinking and start proceeding. Not saying that that's what will happen, but understanding not only our side, but the European side, because they really don't want us to leave ultimately. And I think, we should take a bit more notice of what the EU 27 are telling us.
Thanks, Mary. I think you're absolutely right on so many things, especially the Tory failures. The idea it's all going to be done in 2 years is balmy. That's Theresa May's target. And of course, Theresa May never changes her mind, does she? So we'll wait and see what happens about that one. I just want to agree with a lot of what you said. I won't repeat it all. So I just hand over to Darren next. I think after 2 weeks in Parliament, you can just tell us everything, really, and solve all our problems. So over to you.
If only. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. To put the last couple of weeks in context, I'd spent the last few years as a key seat candidate in the 2015 general election and losing, as a campaigner for the Remain campaign and losing, traveling to Miami-Dade for Hillary Clinton and losing. And so I thought, I might take a break. And then the snap election was called, and I, like many of the other 106 key seat candidates from the last general election, paused to think, because hats off to each and every one of them for their sheer dedication and contribution to trying to help us win the general election at the last time. It was a hard slog and an expensive one as well. And I came to the conclusion that Bristol North West is my home. It's where I was born and grew up. It's where my politics was formed. And there was an important argument to be made. It was 60% Remain. It has one of the biggest import and export ports in the country. Hundreds and hundreds of Nissan cars are adapted in its boundaries. We have thousands of workers for Airbus and their supply chain businesses, and many others. And it was represented by a Brexit Tory MP who said, "Don't worry, I'm only 51% leave." But I voted for it anyway. And I thought, sod it. Regardless of the fact that it's going to take another 7 weeks and I need to take time off of work, and my wife rolls her eyes, and I think, this is the right thing to do. And so I decided to run an unashamedly pro-European campaign. And I did that without consulting with anybody. And some people thought I did the wrong thing. Because, of course, there were a number of Labour voters who voted for Brexit because of their views on immigration. And partly because I thought we didn't really stand a chance of winning Bristol North West. I thought, well, I don't really care, to be honest. I've got the gig. Here's the leaflet. Send them off. And on the front of my... hey, it worked. On the front of my election address, which had to be done 36 hours after my selection, which helped with my lack of consultation with members and others, the headline was "The Local Pro-European Choice." And the whole leaflet apart from some sections on really important issues around schools and the health service, school cuts especially, was a big issue for us in the constituency. The whole thing was on Europe. Even the endorser box, where you put someone that isn't quite your mum, but says, Darren's great, you should vote for him, and I'm going to as well. I put an EU flag.
All of the EU.
Yeah, exactly. And then we got on with it. And I am convinced that I was elected on a pro-European mandate. The Conservative share of the vote in my constituency went down only 2%. It's a pretty solid Tory vote in Bristol North West. And we only ever win Bristol North West when we win in government. It was one of the longest running bellwethers in the country. This was the evidenced fact. That's why I thought I wasn't going to win. The national polls were awful for us. The pollsters said I stood a 6% chance. I wish I'd bet some money on myself at the bookies. But it was an important argument to make, and we won. And I think that Bristol North West, being a bellwether, reflects the mood of the nation, and it reflected the mood of the nation on Europe and rejected Theresa May's no deal is better than a bad deal position. And so, to answer the question clearly, is the customs union or single market back on the table? Let me tell you, yes, it is. I may be a junior backbencher without an office, but it is on the table. And I'll be doing everything I can with others on a cross-party basis where required to ensure that we get the best outcome from this process. Now, that strong line has led to me within 7 days of being identified as a Labour rebel. Which maybe has something to do with the fact I still have no office. But, I don't know. But on Europe, it has to be a red line for me, because in my constituency, as an example, the Sunday before new MPs arrived on the Monday, Airbus said that they would leave the country if they didn't get what they needed from the trading negotiations with Europe. That's 4,000 jobs, an enormous anchor business in my constituency that employs numerous supply chain businesses. And I will not let anybody tell me that I can't stand up for the livelihoods of those workers in my constituency. That is my first priority. Now, regardless of what it said in the manifesto, and I've already been accused of trying to set up the Darren Jones party, but let me be clear, I am not, that has to be my job. And I'll be doing everything I can to ensure that we end up, personally, I'd quite like Brexit not to happen, but that might be a bit adventurous, although, I'll happily support it if we end up in that position. But at least with single market membership. And be clear on the difference between single market membership and single market access. Membership is where we need to be ending up. The customs union in and of itself may be fine as an alternative to no deal for the likes of the wings that need to get shipped out of my constituency from Airbus to the continent, or the importing of cars to be adapted. Although maybe we'll have a conversation later on the paperwork around origins of the bits that make them all up, which makes it very complicated. But for the 78% of our economy that is services-based, customs union does not provide the protections or the support that we need to ensure a strong economy. And I go back to the point of my constituents, not just those that work in Airbus, but those that send their kids to school, those that use our health service, those that rely on our local authority. We can only fund public services, dare I say it, with a strong economy. And Theresa May is not providing that option. And we have to stand up and say a strong economy is a pro-European economy. And we will not be deluded by the concepts of a great trading nation when we crash out onto WTO rules, when cars can no longer be imported, when the economy slumps, when sterling goes down, when house prices are affected, and when my constituents suffer as a consequence. So yes, it's on the table. Have faith. There are MPs that will fight for it, and I'll do everything I can with many others to make sure that we end up in that position.
Thanks, Darren. That was brilliant. I think it's jobs, 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 as you say. Brilliant speech. So, Barry, over to you. You've got so much to react to, plus your own thoughts as well. So keen to hear from you. Thank you.
Look, can I just say, Darren, you're absolutely right never to take any help from the central party in an election. I think that's absolutely right. I've had that as a rule for 20 years, and I put that down to the fact that I'm still there. You've got to run your own election because you know your electors better than anybody else. What I want to start off by saying is really rather like what Mary said, and that is that I too campaigned vigorously throughout the referendum campaign to stay in the European Union. I believe that that is absolutely, it would have been the best possible result, that we should have voted to remain. And Mary said, I don't see how we can leave. Well, I didn't see how we could leave and still be as prosperous as we are, but unfortunately we didn't win that campaign. And Andrew spoke very powerfully of first and second principles. I didn't join the SDP. I joined a DSP, a Democratic Socialist Party, the Labour Party. And that means the order of those words is very important to me. Democracy comes first. And unfortunately, democracy in the referendum decided that we should leave the European Union. And all of us said that that was important, the decision that we were taking, that it would last for a generation. And therefore the question now is, how do we carry out our democratic mandate in a way that is consistent with the economic and political objectives that we want to achieve? So let's start off by talking about what is actually being negotiated. This is the first time that a trade agreement has ever been negotiated not to reduce the barriers to trade between parties, but to increase them. It's an extraordinary situation that we find ourselves in. And we're doing it, some of us on this side reluctantly, but we're doing it for purely non-economic but political reasons. Those are the political reasons that were set out on the UK side in the referendum. And we all know that there were lies and all sorts of things going on, but fundamentally there were issues around paying money to the EU budget, sovereignty, I put it very loosely, whether that's sovereignty in terms of courts or sovereignty in terms of alignment with EU regulation, and border controls. So there are political reasons that are driving this process from the UK side. And what I think we often forget, and what Mary highlighted so well, is that there are also political reasons that are to the forefront of our partner states in the 27 other countries of the EU. I did prepare a slide. If we could have that slide up on, this is just so we have clarity about exactly who's in, who's out, where they are, and what it means, okay? And I'm sorry, for some people this is absolutely teaching their grandmothers to suck eggs, but for others I hope it may be helpful. And I wanted to address the first question that was posed on the title of our session about the customs union. So, you can see that part of the Venn diagram that incorporates the customs union. Turkey, if Andorra and San Marino will forgive me as dismissing them as not major European economies, then let's focus on Turkey, okay? Turkey's responsibilities are as an external member of the customs union. It's not a member of the customs union, it's an external member of the customs union. And it actually joined the customs union on what it saw as being its progress into the European Union, as becoming part of what it hoped would be the EU 29. So Turkey has to accept the common customs tariffs on all goods coming from third-party countries as determined by the EU 28. The EU 28 are the members, they set the rules and those tariffs. Turkey has to abide by those rules as per Article 16 of the Ankara Association Agreement. Now, the second point, if you adopt the customs union model, is that you can't enter into a separate bilateral free trade agreement with any third-party country unless such a deal is concluded with the EU first, and then you have to, in fact, you must conclude the same deal bilaterally that the EU has just negotiated. Actually, Turkey has to do that even if it's against Turkey's best economic interests. It still has to do that. Now, there are difficulties, and in fact, it's proved very difficult because there's an EU agreement with Mexico that Turkey has not been able to replicate because Mexico doesn't particularly want to do a bilateral deal with Turkey. But it is bound in those two ways. It can't make separate bilateral free trade agreements, and it has to make bilateral free trade agreements that may be against its own economic interests. The third point, as part of the customs union, is that you're required to align your regulatory regime with the EU's acquis. So it has no say in the rules that it must adopt. That means that alignment is not only with the regulations on competition or treaties and directives, but it also entails abiding by the case law of the European Court of Justice. It has to abide by the ECJ case law precedent, but it can't bring a case to the court itself. So let's look at this as a possible model. As a transition, it may have attractive points. We already accept the common tariffs, and whilst Turkey, in effect, was going, although it seems to have hit the buffers, but it was going on a journey that was taking it increasingly to adopt the acquis as it became a member of the EU, it's feasible to say that we would not have that greater alignment, we would go in the other direction on a lesser alignment as we leave the EU. So that's possible. But the second element really, I think, is problematic, because it precludes us doing any free trade agreements with the USA, with China, with Japan, with Australia, or the Gulf states, which are our 5 biggest export markets after the EU. Now, if we are coming out of the European Union, and depending on what the deal that we do is, not to be able to do a deal with the other 5 largest export markets and trading partners that we have would be hugely damaging to our economy because we're going to have to make up that slack somehow. The CBI said Turkey has no influence over the rules of the customs union or the other rules it has to implement to comply with the customs union agreement. Were the UK to be outside the EU but inside the customs union, it would be faced with a situation where it could not influence the rules of the game to serve its interests. In addition, the UK would play no role in negotiating trade deals with third countries, opening up UK markets to foreign competition, but not guaranteeing reciprocal access. That's the Mexico bit. So you have to, as Turkey at the moment does, accept all the imports that come in via the EU or into you directly from Mexico. Your market is liberalized to them, but there's no reciprocity here. It's not an equivalence. Their market is not liberalized to you until you negotiate the bilateral deal. The Economist said the customs union may not be a suitable long-term home after Brexit, but it could provide temporary benefits while a fuller trade agreement is being worked out. So I just want to lay on the table what it is that the customs union has as potential benefits and potential costs to us that we would face going forward. Now let's look at the EEA model. So you can see that the European Economic Area includes on the other side, and again, forgive me perhaps by ignoring Liechtenstein and Iceland, but let's talk principally about Norway on the other side here. Now, Being a member of the EEA but not of the customs union, again, there are costs and benefits here. They have the obligation as a member of the EEA to pay into the EU budget. And of course, Turkey did not have that. So one of the things that was the political direction for the UK's vote about do we pay into the EU budget, under the EEA, we would have to pay into the budget, whereas if we were in the customs union, we wouldn't. It also has the obligation to include in its law EU legislation covering the 4 freedoms. That includes the free movement of people, which was the second political shibboleth of the Leave voter. And some people have suggested that within the EEA, the UK would have the scope to curb the free movement of people in ways it can't currently do. Unfortunately, that's not strictly true. We actually have all the capacity to curb freedom of movement at the moment that we would have under the EEA. We chose not to do so. It's under the Citizens' Rights Directive of 2004, which covers all EEA members, including Norway, but it critically guarantees the rights of citizens and family members of European citizens to reside freely within the territory of all EEA member states. And therefore, again, that sense of one of the shibboleths of the Leave vote, the political constraints that we face in the UK around free movement and the control of borders, is something which EEA membership would pose political problems for. Now, of course, Norway is also required to align its regulatory regime with the EU acquis. It's no say in the rules it's obliged to pass into law, and of course that is the third shibboleth of sovereignty for which people voted for Brexit. Fourth, it's obliged to follow the ECJ rulings, but can't bring cases to the court itself. So it has recourse to the EFTA court, but the EFTA court and the ECJ court mirror each other's rulings, so whichever one passes a ruling first, the other one is obliged then to adopt the precedent that it set. It's called the two-pillar structure. So the benefits of EEA are maximum market access, as if a member of the EU, and ability to negotiate its own FTAs, its own external tariffs, and also set its own fisheries and agricultural policies. But it's bound by no state aid rules as well. So you can see that there are political costs and benefits to all of these. I have a model for Switzerland, but Peter's telling me that time is of the essence here, so I'm going to leave. Please excuse me if you want to discuss Switzerland and the EFTA. I'm very happy to do so at a later time. But let me then move swiftly on to the final element of this. And that is what happens if we're out of the lot. So it would require a free trade agreement, that is, if we're out of the lot and not onto WTO rules, okay, which I think anybody who understands the implications of WTO rules should understand that actually it's not that no deal is better than a bad deal. No deal is actually the worst possible deal, WTO rules. It gives you all the disadvantages. And can I just also say, it's not this trump card that Theresa May seems to think she has this trump card. She can go into the negotiating table and say, well, if you don't give me a good deal, I'm playing my trump card and I'm going to flounce off without a deal. Actually, if you look at the Article 50 in the treaty, what it says very clearly is that if at the end of the 2 years negotiating period after triggering Article 50 you haven't concluded a deal, then you are ejected onto WTO rules. So it's not a trump card to be played, it is a cliff edge over which you are pushed, and you're pushed there by the whole process itself. It's part of the administration. So Peter's looking at me very, very forcefully, so I'm going to try and finish very quickly. If we're not to be on WTO rules, What we do need is an FTA that doesn't require us to pay, I'm trying to observe the political objectives, pay into the EU budget, but would allow us to pay in, like Switzerland, and here's the bit that you missed, to important bodies, because Switzerland has a sort of opt-in, opt-out of different of the bodies of the EU, like Erasmus, Euratom, the European Medicines Agency. It also would mean no obligation under the 4 freedoms. So, of course, the whole issue of border controls that was an issue, we would be in total control of our own border controls. An FTA with the EU should offer tariff-free access for the UK's industrial exports, as the FTAs that the EU has concluded with South Korea and now with Canada provide, as well as access to the EU's agricultural markets. Critically, it should provide access to the services and public procurement markets that are essential to our economy. Now, there's a qualification here, because actually we're part of MiFID II and Solvency II directives, and that means that even if we're not part of the EU, we would have, through those directives, the ability to operate and passport those services into Europe. There's an issue over Solvency II, because actually the insurance market in the UK isn't very keen on Solvency II, but MiFID would allow us to do that for the financial services market. And of course, critically, it would enable us to do all of this without the loss of sovereignty enabled by external membership of the customs union. So the question you're all wondering is, so what the hell is the difference between a hard and a soft Brexit? If we can negotiate a Brexit on FTA basis, then the key elements of concern are the Conservatives' desire to deregulate and to diverge from the EU's social and environmental protections. And the mechanism that they have to do that is through the Great Repeal Bill, where these will be incorporated into the UK law, as they say, on day one. Yeah, they will be the same on day one, but we know very well that the government's direction here is to deregulate and to take them away. They're not secured, or they will not be secured by primary legislation, and they will be at the whim of a Secretary of State who can change them through secondary legislation. And that's the real distinction here and the real problem. And that's why we've spoken of the need to have an EU rights and protections bill that actually consolidate those rights and protections, those social and environmental standards and protections, into UK primary legislation. So in balance, what I've tried to do is not to set out, it has to be this or it has to be that. What I'm saying here is actually there are a range of options here, and what we get in one area will influence the sort of option that we may want to take in another. It will also influence what sort of transitional arrangement we may need to have. But the fundamental thing to remember is that driving this is not the economy. Driving this from the UK side has been a set of political objectives, some of which we may agree with, some of which we certainly do not agree with in the Labour Party, but they are expressed in the democratic will of the referendum. And driving it on the other side is the need in Europe to maintain the project, to make sure that anybody who is leaving the club does not encourage others to do so by getting a better deal outside. So that's why I'm a Remainer. Piers Morgan or whoever it was, pointed out, I still have it on my iPad. I'm in. I think the best deal is to stay in. But actually, the referendum said that we had to come out, and that's why we've got to square both the policy, the politics, and the economics of this.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Barry. Everyone's still transfixed by the Venn diagram as well, which has had a huge amount of detail. Thanks very much. So if we could have a few questions before we give the panellists a chance to sum up. Okay, there's a lady on the far side with blonde hair, and there's a gent in front of her in a kind of white shirt, and then there's a lady in white at the front. So perhaps we could go in groups of 3, please. Is there a mic, or are we just shouting? Okay, thank you.
out of that whatsoever, because we haven't differentiated ourselves from the Tories and from everything.
Thanks. We'll probably just have a quick question, if that's all right, because we're a little bit pressed for time, I'm afraid.
Of course, yeah.
Thank you. And then the gent in front had his hand up.
It seems to me that the greatest problem during the referendum was the migration issue. What puzzles me is the fact that so many of the best of the most young people that were needed in other countries to develop their economies have come here often to jobs that are of a much lower quality, need much lower qualifications, and we've become dependent on them and not trained our own. Now, why has there not been that awareness in the EU? Because I think this is one of the things where we feel that they do not move and understand the issue of migration.
Thank you. And lady in the front, do you want the mic? Yeah, please.
Thank you. Since the election result, I've heard a number of Tory Leave campaigners have repeatedly cited that 85% of the electorate have now endorsed parties that are in favour of leaving the EU. I certainly didn't vote Labour to leave the EU when I voted in the general election, so questions arising from that are what are Labour doing to try and quell that myth that's being perpetuated by the Tory leavers. But also this morning, Peter Kellner said that the things that Labour put in its manifesto about the Brexit negotiations would not all be achievable if we leave the EU. So the question, again, so a subsidiary to the first question, is at what point during the next 18 months of the negotiations will the Labour shadow front bench actually say this is not going to be a good deal for our country, and will actually admit or perhaps accept that remaining in the EU is the best deal for the country?
Thank you. So we've got Tory trap, migration, and whether we could actually stay in. Perhaps we could start with Andrew and just have quick answers down the line, please.
Yes, it is a Tory trap. We shouldn't go near it. The idea that people who voted for us were voting for us because of our fudged position on Europe, I find incredible as a proposition. Look, politics is very simple. If you want to leave the EU, you're obviously going to vote Tory. There's no way we're going to be able to outbid the Tories on being more xenophobic and more anti-European than they are. I mean, I can't conceive what the position is that we could adopt that puts us to the xenophobic side of the Tory right than that. The big space in politics which is missing is the space in the middle, in the space of those people who want to stay in Europe, who think we would be trashing our trade, who think we'd be trashing our way of life, and think we'd be turning our back on the world. Now, people say this is about positioning. Of course, it is a position, but it's not about positioning. It's saying what is right for the country, full stop. And once you say what's right for the country, everything else follows. And I just want to make two other points. The business about migration is a really big issue. There's no point ducking it, and it's one of the things I most regret of my time in government is that we didn't level with the British people about what was going on. Let's be frank about that. We need to be open and about it. I was part of a government that said there will be tens of thousands of East Europeans, tens of thousands of East Europeans coming. There weren't tens of thousands, there were hundreds of thousands. And part of what's been happening, and we need to be clear about this in the last few years, is a public reaction against the fact both that that happened and they weren't told, also that some people don't want it to happen, let's be clear about that too, but also the politicians said they were powerless to do anything about it. You should never, if you're an elected politician, say you are powerless to do something that really matters to the voters. So that wasn't a great place to be, and it's completely right to say that we neglected the issue of training and training our own, and we need to put that right. All of those need to be attended to. My own view is that with Merkel and Macron, it might be possible to negotiate something that does give us some kind of opt-out, and that's what we should be seeking to do. But let me come back to Barry's contribution, because things are far too important now not to call a spade a spade. Barry, I have huge respect for. He's a friend of mine. He's made some really brilliant points in his remarks. He's absolutely right to say that no deal is the worst possible deal. He's absolutely right to say that when Theresa May says we would walk away, that's not a trump card, it's a cliff edge. And I have to say, I would want him as one of our trade negotiators because he knows, I mean, that wonderful map, he knows more already about trade negotiators than I think almost anybody who's representing the government in Brussels at present. So the sooner he's there to do it, the better. However, I say all that to him and with great respect. However, let's be clear about this. 44% of our trade is with our EU partners. Another 15% of our trade is with the 39 other countries with which the EU has a bilateral trade negotiation. When he says there are costs and benefits of being outside this, there are massive costs. There are no benefits because what first happens is you hit your trade with the 69% that you're doing, including borders in Ireland. I mean, can you conceive of that? Even the IRA weren't able to get borders up in Ireland. Borders in Ireland, queues at Dover, which I'm told would extend back to Watford of trucks if we start having to impose border controls back again. All of that is before a single negotiator gets to a single negotiating session doing his trade negotiations with the next 5 trading countries that it might be sensible to do. So let me come back to the fundamental point, because at the moment, the British government is representing all of us in Brussels and taking these decisions. There is no benefit to leaving the customs union, no benefit to leaving the single market. We can make them work better. The best thing we can do is to stay in them. The very best thing we can do is to stay in the European Union, but we should not somehow pretend that there are advantages in trashing the national interest and coming in behind David Davis, Liam Fox and Theresa May in what is the most ill-fated venture that this country has engaged in since the Suez Crisis.
Okay, enough any more questions. Mary.
Yeah, I want to say a few words, first of all, about migration. Obviously, it is of concern to people, but interestingly, in the referendum, it tended to be areas where there isn't a lot of migration who were worried about it. I assume a lot of you are from London. London voted 60% to remain, and London is the most diverse city in the whole of the EU. And we know how to do it. And one of the reasons that we've learned how to do it is that we do live, all of us live near and work with and go to school with and everything with people of many different races and religions. And we achieve that because when the whole migration thing was getting quite worrying in the 80s, local authorities and government did a lot of education and a lot of anti-racist work. And we got there and we made London a diverse multicultural city. It might well have happened anyway, but that helped. And there therefore is a strong case for government intervention to get over people's racism and prejudice, which is there and understandably there, but we should never accept it. We should never go down the route of saying, oh yes, people don't like migration, it's okay, it's all right not to like migration. And it's particularly stupid to say that and wrong to say that when we rely on workers from all over the world, particularly from the EU, to keep our economy going. We've been hearing this since the referendum, that various sectors, including National Health Service, care services, agricultural workers and others, those industries and services are going to be decimated when we no longer have EU workers coming into this country. What will happen, obviously, as a result of that is that the economy will shrink. We are going to become much more insular and much poorer. And that seems to be a direct consequence of what is essentially a racist agenda of not allowing migration. The EU does understand this. The EU has been facing the biggest migration crisis in the world for a long time, when refugees from Syria and the Middle East have been coming into Italy and Greece mainly, then moving across the EU, which has sparked all sorts of responses. But I think it would be completely wrong to say that the EU has no idea about migration. What the EU is absolutely clear about is that free movement is very much part of the way the whole project works. Because if you have a single market, you have to allow people to move around that single market to work. Andrew may be right that there may be some scope for negotiating that. And there are already, as somebody said earlier, actually controls on that which the EU doesn't use. For instance, if people come to a country and they don't find work within 3 months, there is a possibility that the member state they've come to can send them back to where they came from. We've never implemented that. So there are already safeguards which we don't use. In terms of Barry, I think we will all want to respond to Barry Gardiner. One of the things I feel very strongly about is the referendum itself. As we all know, it was a wafer-thin majority. It was effectively 2% a difference. In the figures, in the numbers, it was 600,000 people who made the difference. If you halve that because of the way, it's an election, 300,000 people, if they voted the other way, it would have changed it. That is not a majority. That is not the settled will of the British people. And I think we should be saying that in the Labour Party, that this is not democracy. And there's a very good argument for saying that referendums themselves are not democratic. We live in a representative democracy, which is the way that we do things in this country. There are countries like Switzerland, which has already been mentioned, which does operate much more on the basis of referendums. And I think you have a political system which does that. You build in safeguards and it works. It does not work here. Did not work in this referendum, and there are other flaws in it. The franchise of the general election franchise, not the European franchise. So all these people, these EU citizens here have been coming to the European Parliament worried about their livelihoods, couldn't vote in this election for those very same livelihoods. A Scottish referendum allowed votes at 16, which would have made a difference, and so the whole franchise was actually not as it should have been. So there's that argument as well. It was not a democratic exercise. And I think that's why it's important that we think about having a means of writing that. And this general election actually went some way towards doing that, because seats which were Remain have voted even more Remain, and there is a shift in public opinion. The opinion polls themselves are showing that, and I wasn't here this morning, but I imagine Peter Kellner talked about that. Public opinion is moving. A referendum is a snapshot on one day. The EU, our membership of the EU, our future, our economy, our children's future is too important to say it's a snapshot on one day is actually going to affect the whole future of this country. That is not democracy. That is not the way we should run our affairs.
Thank you. Darren, migration, Tory trap and staying in.
Yeah, in that order. Firstly, on migration, I think there's 3 points. Firstly, we need to continue to show that a lot of the concerns around migration are a falsehood. People's anger was about stagnating wages, the ability to get work, how quickly they could see a GP, the availability of housing. And the populists in UKIP and the Tories and other places used the simple answer of saying, well, it's because there's too many people. And that's why we saw these odd statistics where actually the fear of immigration was highest in the areas that were the least diverse. Actually, Labour needs to be saying that we can solve all of those issues around public services by investing in them in the way that we set out in the general election, and be clear that actually those constraints aren't because of migration. But at the same time, we must be clear that in some circumstances, we do need to regulate the market. So in my constituency in Bristol Northwest, when I was campaigning at the last general election in 2015, I had a conversation with a lady in an area called Avonmouth, which is near to where I grew up, and it kind of runs parallel to the industrial zone that we have. And her son, who had just left school, was applying for a job in a logistics company. And the employer said to him, look, son, I can't give you a job because you don't speak Polish and you're not going to integrate with my workforce. Now, for that young guy and for his mum, there's an accurate frustration there. You know, he's born and grew up in the area, he wants to go to work, and he was told he couldn't because he wasn't able to speak Polish. And these issues of rogue employers, not just on that issue, but also cramming houses with migrant labour, which is exploiting them as opposed to doing it illegally here, not paying the minimum wage, undercutting wages. We do need to tackle that. So where people have concerns around migration, we mustn't say that they're racist or wrong. Some of them are. But in some cases, there are genuine concerns which we need an answer to. And lastly, on the migration point, let's be clear, by being members of the European Union or members of the single market, we can have these protections and reforms to migration. We can deliver that while securing our economic position by being either members of the EU or the single market. Quickly going on to the question of Tory traps and what does a good deal look like. Barry did a great job of explaining something that's very complicated. I am an EU law expert, so I know only too well how confusing it can be. But with the greatest respect, I can't put that slide on a leaflet. And we, as the Labour Party, a party of government, need to be clear with people about what our vision is for the future of this country and how we ensure prosperity for people. That isn't that. We need a clear answer on that. And my view as a clear answer is single market membership at the very least. And lastly, on the referendum, I would probably slightly disagree with Mary on the nuance of the referendum. People did vote on majority to leave the European Union. I respect that view. What I do think, however, is that they didn't vote to leave on any basis. They didn't see the terms on which we leave the European Union, and they deserve the right to change their mind. Why should tens of millions of British people be stuck to something they thought they were going to have, when actually it turns out to be something that's going to be a disaster for them and their family? So I've always said that when the trade deal or deal comes to the Commons, if it gets voted down, that we should go to a second referendum on the terms of which we should leave, and part of that should be, actually, do you want to change your mind? Hang on, there was another point. I'll leave it because of the time. There you go.
Thanks. Okay, Barry, could you just a quick answer?
Could I be brief? People have been asking me that for a long time. Can I just say, let me answer the questions first, or the points that were put. We were candidates together in 90. We were. I thought we were. Oh, no, well. You asked about the 85% of the electorate and this myth that they keep on coming out with. And yes, it is absolutely infuriating. No, we weren't in favour, but what we did do is we did say that we would respect the referendum result and that we would that we would trigger Article 50. That's where they get it from, but we are trying to counter that every time the Tories say it. And you're absolutely right to point it out, because it's wrong. Is it a Tory trap? The lady at the back, I think it's a Tory schism. They have got themselves into a mess over Europe for 40 years, and they're continuing to get themselves in a mess. And if you look at what Philip Hammond is now doing to try and get their form of a soft Brexit, which is not going on to their form of a hard Brexit, rather than Theresa May's form or Liam Fox's form of a hard Brexit. Fox, David Davis, Peter Lilly, John Redwood, that lot would love to come straight out onto WTO rolls and have a deregulated tax haven off the shores of Europe. That's what they want. Philip Hammond wants a Tory hard Brexit, grand Tory hard Brexit, which maintains all the equivalence of regulations that, as I said, in MiFID and so on, that would guarantee the financial services markets the access into Europe that they want, but it would completely undermine the environmental and social protections that we think are the bedrock of a decent society. And so it's not so much a trap they've laid for us, it's a schism within their own
Final
party.
thought, if that's all right, please, Barry.
Yes, on migration and the referendum. I agree with what Darren was saying about what actually underlies the problems and the fears that people have on migration. Of course, we should be doing the apprenticeships, growing our own, training our own people, ensuring that those jobs can be taken here. But we do want a free movement of labour, and that's essential for our economy to function properly. And Mary is absolutely right. My biggest regret in 20 years of being in Parliament is that I did not stand up. It wasn't that I lacked the guts. I didn't actually see it. I was so stupid, I didn't see it. And I didn't stand up and say, this is ridiculous. If you are talking about a constitutional change and you are having a referendum where you ask the British people what their settled will is going to be over the next 25 years, you put in place a threshold. And that threshold should have been 60, 66%, because otherwise we have exactly what we now have in Scotland, them saying, oh, well, let's have another referendum. You have exactly the call for, let's do it all over again. And actually, if this can turn on one or two people changing their mind, it is ridiculous. Trouble is, none of us said it at the time. What we said at the time, and this brings me back to the fundamental politics of this, the fundamental democracy of this, we said, please vote to stay, to remain in the European Union, because this vote will determine what happens for the next 40 years. I'm afraid to say the room and the mood of the room today is now to say, actually, you know what, we didn't mean it, and you, the electorate, were too stupid to get it right. We, as democratic politicians, have no right to say that.
Thanks, Barry. Have we got... Is that, okay. Could we just have a quick final thought then from all the panelists?
Can I just say,
1 minute.
this is the biggest issue of probably of our generation. I don't agree with what Barry has just said. He's absolutely right that the British people did make a decision, but Tony Blair is completely right when he says the British people are entitled to change their minds. What our role should be now is to encourage them with every sinew in our bodies to persuade them to change their mind. Frankly, if we don't win this, I don't think there's much point in winning other things and subsidiary things and all that, because I don't think it will count. My strong gut instinct, though, is that by winning this, we will win the big argument with the country, and we will also, I think, win the big argument inside the party, which is that we have to be where the people are and standing up for their welfare if we're going to be trusted with the government of the country in a few years' time.
Thanks, Andrew. Okay, Mary,
Yeah.
1 minute, final thought.
Could I just say, I completely agree with Andrew, but I will give up doing this when we see that £350 million going into the NHS. Then we know that it was true. We know it wasn't true, that's never going to materialise. The Leave campaign was quite appalling. It was based on, I will be polite and call them untruths. And that is no way to run a referendum, and that is no way to wait, as Andrew says, the biggest decision any of us will make in our generation. It was all based on lies, and people voted for things which just simply cannot happen.
Thank you. Darren, 1 minute, final thought.
This is the Brexit Parliament. And given the unexpected nature of my election, I don't know whether I'm going to be an MP for 4 months or 4 years. And so, with absolute clarity, with you and everyone else that I can work with, I will do everything I can to answer the question once again, to make sure that we put the national interest above party politicking, that we protect jobs and businesses, and that we end up, at least, as members of the single market. Let's get to it.
Okay, Barry, just 1 minute, final answer, please.
A deeply unpopular summing up from me. And that is that whilst my whole economic brain and my whole heart sympathy is in absolute agreement with the other 3 members of our panel, what I do believe is that if we go against the referendum result, we will unleash in the right wing of our country a backlash against politicians. They will be able to say, you gave us a voice and you took it away. They will say that it is we who are being anti-democratic. And I believe that that would lead to unrest and a real decline in politics in this country. The fundamental principle for me in respecting the referendum result is the democratic traditions of this country. And I don't believe we can go against it.
Okay, thanks very much. Thanks all for coming. Thanks to Progress. Thanks to Barry Gardiner, Darren Jones, Mary Honeyball, and Andrew Adonis. And thanks all to you. Thanks.
Really